Great to be here.
Right. For those who don't know, Dr. David Starr's doctorate was the best biography of Solomon Schechter. And he's working on turning it into a book, but nobody knows more about the day-to-day life of Solomon Schechter than David Starr.
Unquestionably. So we're gonna try to negotiate the technology through Zoom. So I prepared a PowerPoint, and we'll see where this goes. Really, all of you are part of this really, really, really wonderful experiment. Yeah. So brief timeline, because we're talking about Solomon Schechter, but really under the backdrop of Orthodox Judaism. And that's what the course is, Orthodox Judaism in the United States.
Yeah, it's got slides and everything.
Just a quick note, if you could please mute. I muted everybody to begin with, but if you could mute your Zoom on the bottom left, that'd be much appreciated. So very, very briefly, is that Schechter's born in 1847 into a Chabad family in Romania. He is pronounced an Eloi at a very, very young age, studies with a number of rabbinic luminaries, finds himself in 1879 in the Berlin Hochschule, which is sponsored by the Reform element there, but is really known as a center of Wissenschaft, and that's why Schechter attends. The Schechter that we know really emerges in 1882 when he moves to London. And then a few years later is appointed a lecturer and a reader. He's never appointed anything beyond that at Cambridge University. There's the limitations of what Cambridge will do for a Jew and a scholar of rabbinics. And then in 1896, he becomes world famous when he helps discover, he didn't discover it himself, the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Egypt, what we know colloquially, popularly as the Cairo Geniza. Schechter moves to New York in 1902, but it took some wooing. And so one person I could not divine to join us was Abraham Karp, who before Professor Starr was the leading scholar of Solomon Schechter. I didn't manage to resurrect him for this Zoom lecture. And in his article in 1963, he writes about the Solomon Schechter comes to America. The wooing and winning of Solomon Schechter, writes Karp, has its fascination as a romance and importance as a pivotal incident in the cultural and religious history of the Jew in America. Elsewhere, Karp quotes several memoirists about just bringing Schechter, who is this major scholar, and in terms of Wissenschaft, or academic Jewish study, he is really second, without any hyperbole, he is second to none at that moment. And so his eventual successor as the president of the seminary, Cyrus Adler, he recalls, I believe that 8 cities claim the honor of being the birthplace of Homer. I cannot recall how many people claim the honor of having been instrumental in bringing Dr. Schechter to the United States. And another source, part of an important Philadelphia and New York family, Dr. Solomon Salas Cohen, writes that already in 1890, I had the privilege of bearing a message from Sabato Moraeus, who founded the seminary in the 1880s, and his colleagues of the Jewish Theological Seminary that then recently established in New York, asking Schechter to consider the possibility of joining the teaching staff of that institution.
Since we're going experimental, let me add 2 more.
Please.
Julius Greenstone, who was one of Schechter's students, says this: God's messenger has arrived on our shores, a harbinger of good tidings, a forerunner of the glorious era that is to come in American Israel. And then one other. The papers were full of him, Yiddish and English, recalled Herman Rabinovitz, who was one of his students. And Rabinovitz says, quote, even my landlord and landlady were consumed with curiosity about this man. At the first opportunity for them to see Schechter at a public function, they made me promise that I would take them and I would let them have a glimpse of the Schechter. So this is the power of a collaborative class. Continue.
So he's important. So Solomon Schechter is more than just a person. He transcends, he's an idea that eventually migrates to the United States to support an institution that was frankly bankrupt. The seminary needed to be reorganized, and in 1902, finally Schechter is convinced, and he writes elsewhere, that he's convinced that the future of Judaic studies is in the United States, and he comes to New York. And so a lot of this discussion is anchored around Schechter's relationship with others. That here you have a pivotal figure who is freighted with a lot of meaning, as we'll see, a lot of ambiguity. He uses terminologies which are catch-alls to a certain extent that can mean a lot of things to different people. And because he looms so large, not just his community and the seminary now is the flagship of conservative Judaism, but back then also not at all clear. We mentioned Moraeus, who liked to refer to the seminary as a sponsor of enlightened orthodoxy. And eventually in our semester, we'll get to what both Professor Cohen and Professor Sarna have described as the parting of the ways of Orthodox and conservative Judaism, but we're not there yet. According to everybody, we're not there yet. It's really couched in a lot of different religious terminologies. And so Schechter, and this really brings us to what I really want to start with. Schechter, in his very first speech in November 1902, it's published in all the different newspapers, and I want to just seize on the end, and I want to really invite both Professor Starr and Professor Sarna to weigh in on this. And I'll just read it for the group. Those who are entrusted with carrying out the purpose of this institution, this is how Schechter concludes his opening remarks as the head of the seminary, which, as you have seen, aims at the perpetuation of the tenets of the Jewish religion. Both pupils and masters must faithfully and manfully maintain their loyalty to the Torah. There is no other Jewish religion but that taught by the Torah and confirmed by history and tradition and sunk into the conscience of Catholic Israel. What is Catholic Israel? Professor Starr?
Well, I think, the first thing to say about Schechter in this slippery term is that he invests very little energy. He sort of writes about it in a kind of a literary way, but he's not much for philosophy and systematic thinking. So he alludes to it usually in passing. He'll sort of use it in this kind of poetic way, but he never really gives us a kind of a really worked out definition. It seems to me there are at least three that I can think of, understandings of it from himself. The first is, I think it's a part of a kind of not a long, but a decades long reaffirmation of Jewish peoplehood as opposed to religion. That's a conversation that had really begun in the middle of the 19th century. Figures like Peretz Smolensk and other people who are basically saying Western Jews emphasize religion in this kind of Protestantized modern way, and we need to reaffirm Jewishness is fundamentally a peoplehood thing. And that gets you into this kind of transcendent notion of Klal Yisrael. So that's one, I think, source of the way he's thinking about it, which is this a somewhat traditional sense of umiyut, as we would say maybe in modern Hebrew. The second is a kind of a synthesis of the spectrum, right? In other words, there's a left and there's a right, there's a liberal progressive Judaism, and there's a traditionalist Judaism that we would call in institutional terms, and this is what Dr. Elif is titling the course, Orthodoxy. And the Catholic Israel is a kind of a mashup of those religious tendencies. And then the third, which in some ways Professor Cohen wrote the most about in his book, is that it's a kind of counter-Reformation, meaning it's everything to the left of progressive Judaism. It's a very self-conscious kind of reaffirmation of traditionalism in political terms, institutional terms, praxis terms, textual terms. And the problem with Schechter is that at any given moment, you could make the argument that he's either privileging one of those three, or he's sort of, kind of moving back and forth between them. But I think there's truth in all three of those things for him.
Okay, let me jump in and say, first of all, Catholic Israel at a very simple level is his translation of Klal Yisrael.
Right.
The word peoplehood didn't exist. Amiyut didn't exist. There was Klal Yisrael, and he translates. But that, I think, is not quite the power. And as Professor Starr says, there were a lot of mysteries about it. I think the person who understood it was actually Henrietta Zold, who in an article that is not well known, wrote about Schechter's view of Catholic Israel. And here context matters. Remember that both on the left and on the right, you have people who think we need to save Judaism, and what we need are synods. On the left, you've just had one, the Pittsburgh platform, and that is not the first. There have been a whole series of reform synods, top-down changes in Judaism. But actually, there were people in Orthodoxy who also thought we needed a Sanhedrin, or if not a Sanhedrin, we needed what would come to be known, and is still a term still used, Das Torah. We need the rabbis to tell us how things move. Catholic Israel rebelled against both top-down ideas. It was a sense, really, that the totality of the Jewish people should decide the future of Jewry, that we should look at where people are going, and somehow that power in Jewish life should not be with the rabbis, parentheses, although Schechter was a rabbi, he was actually scornful of rabbis. Anyone who reads his letters, and Starr has read many more than I have, sees him full of scorn for rabbis, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, which he founded, was a place where their successes became scholars, and their failures became rabbis. And the conservative rabbis knew that they were scorned by the faculty, and that goes back to Schechter. So Catholic Israel, as I understand it, is a statement that Das Torah is not how we should go, and synods are not how we should go, that somehow or other the demos, the people as a whole, will see a Jewry, but at a deep level, it was a statement that the alternative views, which invariably had rabbis as leaders, Jewish theocracy, was, as far as Schechter was concerned, anathema.
I would just add to that, Zev.
Not just me, but the other 40 so other people in the classroom.
Excuse me?
I said not just to me, but to the other 40 people in the classroom.
I would just add to what Jonathan said that in addition to the sort of political dimension of this, in terms of it being a conversation Schechter vis-a-vis these folks with whom he is sparring, as it were, in space, right? That is to say, progressives, liberals to the left of him, and traditionalist Eastern European yeshiva types to the right of him, arguably. It's also, it seems to me, a very romantic view of Jewish tradition, right? In other words, it's not just a kind of a jurisprudential, halachic approach to the way we make psak or decide about theological questions. It's a kind of an affirmation of the Jewish past, of Jewish civilization, the totality of Jewish text and tradition, that is this thing for which he has great love. And he believes that in some kind of romantic, sort of inchoate way, that's the thing upon which we have to double down. That's why the scholarship is so important to him. Because, and of course, if we had the honor of sitting here with people like Professor Sarna's late father, may he rest in peace, Schechter is a part of a generation of scholars who are doing Wissenschaft out of a deep love and embeddedness in a tradition. And they are doing this out of a faith in that tradition, and they are doing this to make the tradition more and not less relevant. And so, in other words, it comes back to not just the sense of demos of Klal Yisrael, but the power of the tradition of Klal Yisrael in its greatest form, which are its literary, intellectual, spiritual treasures. How you then work that out in terms of what that looks like as an operative philosophy, obviously is much more complicated. But Schechter has, that's why when he goes to, that's why probably the greatest moment in his life is when he goes to Cairo and he writes this famous article, I think it's in the London Times. He says, in effect, I was standing in 1,000 years of Jewish history, right? When he climbs down through that wall and he is standing in all of that stuff, he has this incredible sense that Jewish history is alive. It's real.
He's also democratized medieval Jewish history in the same way that he's looking to democratize.
And it's not just democracy. Remember, part of what the seminary is engaged in, almost all of its faculty, is the publication of new texts. And that is also part of the work of Wissenschaft, make it near domim. We are going to make available texts that you've never seen. Louis Ginsburg's legends, most of these are not legends that were widely known. He's plowed through hundreds of books, including little-known Christian texts. That's why the footnotes are so important, in order to find and broaden their sense of what Jewish texts are. So, the Cairo Geniza precisely is living proof that Judaism was much broader than the yeshiva that Schechter and others were a little bit rebelling against, because now you had all of these new texts that likewise shed light on ideas found in Jewish life, some of them ideas that might later be dismissed as heretical. But there was a sense that Torah was much, much broader than most people knew. And that, I think, is also why Schechter was so excited to find all these new fragments and books and so on in the Cairo Geniza, because that helped to prove the point. And it was likewise why the seminary wants to put together the greatest Jewish library in the New World. So again, all of these little known texts can somehow be part of the tradition. And if you therefore decide, and here's to the point of the class, that you want to modify something, you don't, like the reformers, just change it. Instead, you discover some medieval authority whose views match yours, and you can then anchor your change in the tradition.
The irony.
That to them is not quite the same as orthodoxy, but it allows you to be orthopraxy, even though your mind is wide open. And
Sure.
that, I think, is very much what Schechter is about.
But then it's a great irony is that the most vociferous outcry to Schechter's migration to the United States was from the Reform, where you find that Kaufman Kohler, who in a year, I believe, would be becoming the president of Hebrew Union College, the flagship of Reform Judaism. And here you have Manuel Schreiber writing a series of articles. Is Schechter Orthodox? And here's the first one. And you see the image actually took that from Dr. Sarna's book, where he's sitting with Kohler and a few other Reform leaders,
Right. Yeah.
questioning, is this man Orthodox? And it seems like his arrival, because he still speaks in the name of tradition and traditional, although previously unknown, but still traditional sources, that here is the great victory of Orthodoxy over Reform.
I have no doubt that the Reform movement, and Mike, you should feel free to jump in here, I have no doubt that they were petrified by Schechter's appointment because they thought the seminary was dying. Moraeus was dead, Blumenthal, its president, was dead, Kohut was dead, Nebuch, the whole seminary passed away in the 1890s. And suddenly, and therefore, the folks at Hebrew Union College thought they would win by default. And suddenly, I don't know, there's like the present day resurrection of Joe Biden. Suddenly, tradition is making a comeback, not just a small comeback, but the greatest Jewish scholar in many ways in Europe, a man who was internationally famous, was coming to America. So, you know, some of them are going to try and say he's not really Orthodox. He's one of us. That's not totally wrong if Orthodox means what the new Agudat HaRabbanim, Agudas HaRabbonim, is going to say it means, but certainly anyone who reads Schechter sees that he had a different idea, not a centrist Judaism as JTS would later become, that's Schechter's disciples. His idea is, I'm going to build this grand coalition of everybody to the right of reform, and so everyone will either be a little conservative or a little liberal, just like Gilbert and Sullivan said, and they assume that the people way to the right who didn't consider Schechter truly Orthodox, that those were kind of immigrant figures who would in time come around. And after all, for quite a while, and I think you have a slide on this, that seemed reasonable because the Orthodox Union, which has not really had a central Orthodox figure, will for a time embrace Schechter and hope that he will be the great bulwark against reform, which they saw as the enemy. And indeed, it isn't very long before you have a Judaism where Kohler represents the liberal end and Schechter seems to represent the traditional end, and everybody either to the extreme left, like, I don't know, Felix Adler, or to the extreme right, like the Rabbonim of the Agudas HaRabbonim, they're going to be marginalized.
Sure. So but it doesn't work. And Professor Cohen, maybe to take us through this slide, it's a well-cited article in the American Hebrew, a newspaper which championed Schechter throughout his career. You remember, he would die, I believe, in 1915. So he wasn't in America for all that long.
Yeah. You want me to read this, or are you?
No, it's a read. I think it's been on for everybody to look at, but essentially this is the American Hebrew really attacking the Agudas HaRabbanim's ban on English sermons. Kind of seems funny now, and students of the seminary, and what was known by then as Schechter Seminary. So Professor Sarna talked about how that you would get this wide swath between Kaufman Kohler, who was at one point a radical reformer. He was the one who moved Shabbos to Sunday at one point. He had become a little more, not conservative, but a little more moderate later on in his career. That's how he was able to succeed Isaac Mayer Wise as the president. Milzner in between them at Hebrew Union College. But it doesn't work because you have this Eastern European migration, and they have no truck for Schechter Seminary.
Yeah, and I think one of the later slides that we'll see really, speaks to this spectrum. I think there's one sense that what is Schechter Orthodox? What exactly is he? I think the question of, and who can he unite? I think that becomes a very big piece of it when we see this this letter with these definitions coming up shortly. Well, I'll hop in when that one comes up. But I think it will speak to that question of not only who is he, but who does he hope to pull into this kind of coalition?
Yeah, remember.
I won't jump the gun on that.
Remember also this question of the the heresy hunting piece of this. For Schechter, this goes back to the 1880s. He's a kid basically, with virtually no professional standing. He's in effect an independent itinerant scholar in London in the 1880s, and already there's an quote unquote Orthodox Jewish newspaper in London. And, people are going to hear his talks at Jews College and other places, and they sort of ferret out, oh, he's not really Orthodox. There are battles about the triennial cycle in different synagogues. There are battles about reading text. There are battles about what he's teaching. Is he talking too much about Agadah, not about enough about Halakha? And people are casting aspersions on him. They don't doubt his erudition, but they do have a sense, a kind of a litmus test. And Schechter already in the 1880s is in effect saying, in fact, in some cases publicly, look, I'm not claiming that I'm Orthodox. So this is a European conversation that is in effect coming to America, which is this kind of anxiety in the part of some circles in the traditionalist world, Hungarians versus Germans, some Germans versus other Germans, about what does Orthodoxy really mean. And he's caught up in that as well. And so that, he brings that with him.
He becomes a symbol, because Orthodoxy in the United States is just starting to regain its foothold. In my class, we've already gone through Isaac Gleiser and Morris Raphael. Those people died in 1868, both of them actually. And it looks as if, even Isaac Mayer Wise is the head of Reform. He has this statement in the 1880s where he says, I'm the new Orthodoxy.
Sure. As
if to bury this 19th century German-style Orthodoxy. And when you have this wave of migration, for everybody tuning in, just to give you some demography for a moment, in 1880, there are about 250,000 Jews in the United States. By 1900, so basically when Schechter arrives, there are 1 million. It quadruples in size. By 1920, there are 3 to 3.5 million. So we're becoming, American Jewry is becoming overwhelmed with Eastern European migration, which are seeking to redefine what it means or reestablish what Orthodoxy means. And the Agudas HaRabbanim, which is also founded in 1902, actually the afternoon.
Same year, right?
So what happens, and it's quite obnoxious if you think about it, the history, is that a failed experiment, Rahman al-Itzlah, and Rabbi Yaakov Yosef has a very, very difficult time in the New World. He comes in the late 1880s. He dies in 1902, and that afternoon, after they bury him, the rabbis come together and say, well, the chief rabbi model didn't work out. What if we build a rabbinical conference? That's the Agudas HaRabbanim. Their first rule is, in order to be a member, you need to have received ordination not in America, which excludes the seminary's entire project.
Right.
And they're seeking to redefine in a Lithuanian milieu.
Right.
What exactly is Orthodoxy? And as Professor Starr pointed out, Schechter is not a traditional Talmudist. Was he adequate in a base medrash and a Beit Midrash? No doubt. But that's not how he styled himself. That's not how he wrote. He didn't look that, he had long beard, but didn't look that part at all. And so part of the reason why this is important to map Schechter's emergence onto the history of Orthodox Judaism is because his arrival at that moment is an indicator of where Orthodoxy is headed.
Right. Do remember that Schechter unusually embodies within himself different aspects of Orthodoxy, meaning he has started out, his parents are Chabad Hasidim, and he starts out in Romania in a traditional Hasidic milieu. He's then become acquainted with German Orthodoxy, even though, as you properly point out, he attended a Reform seminary. He then goes to England and is clearly deeply influenced by aspects of British Orthodoxy, and there are many aspects of the Jewish Theological Seminary that can only be understood if one is familiar with the orthodoxy that the chief rabbi creates, the Adlers in the 19th century create in England. And there are whole customs at the seminary, those who know conservative Judaism, a custom of saying, Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, the psalm for the Sabbath day in Mincha on Shabbat, was a German custom, comes to England, brought to the seminary, known today in many conservative synagogues, but not part of the Polish custom that most Orthodox Jews know. So there are many ways that this man brings together different ideas about Orthodoxy, and he, in that sense, I think, was able to talk to a lot of different Orthodox Jews, and he's going to write sympathetically about Hasidism and about Safed and so on. And actually, he's going to personally stamp out efforts, including to make fun of right-wing orthodoxy. The Jewish Publication Society was all set to publish a kind of anti-Hasidic work, and Schechter killed it. The book was by no less than Naftali Hertz Imber, the author of Hatikva, and Schechter doesn't want that. But nevertheless, by the end of Schechter's sojourn in America, just before he dies, he, I think, does appreciate that for all of his efforts, the Orthodox are not accepting of him, And that's why he's going to have to found the United Synagogue rather than rely on the Orthodox Union. And people like the Ramaz and so on, Margulies, are going to kind of take over the position of Orthodoxy, and the project to look ahead of American Judaism between the wars is greater and greater separation, so that we will then have from one movement, two movements, one calling itself conservative, but increasingly that's a synonym for centrist, and the other calling itself orthodoxy, and doing everything possible to distinguish itself from the world.
But in the thick of his jousting, and really it's a one-sided jousting between the Agudas HaRabbanim and Schechter's seminary. And this quote is important not just because Schechter said it in 1905, but also where it's published. You'll see it's in the Yiddish Tagblatt. I translated this from Yiddish.
Sure.
It is not necessary to emphasize that this is an Orthodox seminary. See how he's exasperated. It is a Jewish seminary. Of course it is Orthodox also. I never knew, I'm reading it as if Schechter was saying it, that I'm Orthodox till I came to this country. Meaning in Britain, I never had to answer to this. In my father's home, also in Romania, we used to speak more of Judaism, so he's echoing this discussion of Catholic Israel, than of Orthodoxy. He's fed up, he's tired of it.
It's interesting because it shows you that as far as he has traveled from small town southeastern Europe to Cambridge to New York, he still in some ways has this a very folk cultural view of a kind of a Gemeinschaft Judaism that is a kind of a neo-medieval Judaism where those distinctions literally didn't exist. They held no meaning for him.
The term Orthodox is almost impossible to find in American Judaism really until the 1840s. You only have Orthodox when you have somebody who's heterodox. So as the Reform movement gets going, and especially when you have in South Carolina a battle between those who want to introduce an organ and those who fight the organ, is first in the 1840s, then of course one group calls itself Orthodox to distinguish itself from heterodox.
So my students,
it's very hard to find the word Orthodox before then.
Right. So I was happy to find also in response to the very first Reform group in Charleston is Jacob Mordecai, who says I'm Orthodox. It's always a response. My students actually have heard me talk about this. Right.
You also see in as we're working through these materials, a central tension that is cropping up because we began talking about Catholic Israel as this, how did Professor Sarna put it? I mean, this sort of faith in the demos, in the people, and a kind of an impatience or a denigration of the notion of these sort of rigid ideological modern groupings as being somehow non-Jewish, according to people like Schechter. But you see that the tension, because ultimately this becomes a kind of a political, it's an intra-communal political conversation about who's going to have the power to mold these immigrants, to build the institutions, to get the funding, to if you use the chief rabbi example that Professor Sarna brought up from the UK, who is going to shape this emerging community? What's going to be, of course, the largest Jewish community in the world. It's going to replace Poland. Everybody thinks that. This is literally the new world, and people feel like this is the future. So for all of Schechter's talk about, commitment to Klal Yisrael, he also has a sense politically and kind of by his nature, he wants the power to be the one who is training the teachers, training the rabbis, who are going to take those downtown immigrants living on Hester Street, and if not change them, at least mold their kids and make American traditional Judaism.
And what's interesting about this moment is that right now, evangelicals and mainline Protestants are creating these federations. They're blending together. They're trying to blur. They're trying to create the equivalent of Catholic Israel. And even Kaufman Kohler in the 1890s was suggesting, and Wise before him, this idea of union. Why did Hebrew Union College? Why union? He didn't want to call it a reform seminary. This was Minhag America. His vision was for all of American Judaism. Kohler, at first, is very upset about this when he arrives in the 1860s, but he eventually moves into Wise's camp towards the very end, very unpredictably, considering who his father-in-law David Einhorn was. Kohler tries to absorb that spirit of elasticity, of a Catholic sense of religion.
Yeah.
But by the onset of the 1900s, 20th century, he's lo and behold created classical Reform Judaism. Meanwhile, the Orthodox are saying we have no part in this. We don't recognize this Judaism at all. And so what Schechter's doing is part of this. He's hearkening back to a 19th century idea in American Judaism. And he's also trying to do what the other religious groups in America are effectively doing. They are breaking down denominational barriers and creating these councils and these federations.
I think that all of the great leaders believe that ultimately I have the solution and my form of Judaism in due time will become the Judaism of all American Jews. Isaac Mayer Wise says that explicitly about Minhag America, but there's no doubt that the Jewish Theological Seminary under Schechter has the hope, and under Louis Finkelstein will believe that it has actually succeeded in so monopolizing American Judaism that those on the right will become conservative and those on the left will become conservative, and we will be the dominant force, said they, well into the early 1970s in American Jewish life. One of the lessons there is that the greatest danger to a Jewish movement is believing that history is on your side. That's a sign that you stop innovating, stop working, stop looking around you, and you're in for a great fall. That's what happened to reform in the early 20th century, and that's what happened to the conservative movement 70 years later. But absolutely, I think Schechter imagined that Cincinnati was finished. It would take time, and New York, which is growing so rapidly, will become the great center of Jewry, and the seminary will lead it. They were not paying attention to Yitzchak Elchanan and Revel and so on, Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary. None of those institutions, to their mind, really would lead. And indeed, the great strike of Yeshiva College was really, we want to be trained the way those folks at JTS are being trained, which was almost a tacit admission that the future is, to their mind, with the seminary. And of course, for several decades, quite a few people are going to migrate from Orthodoxy to the Jewish Theological Seminary, believing that they could indeed have both tradition and halakha as well as modernity.
Right. And my students next week will read Jeff Gurok's article on this, as well as your article on the divisions of scholarship and rabbinate in the seminary. I believe, Professor Cohen, you wanted to chime in, but I also want you to lead us in the next slide.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't see the slide on my screen here. Which one do we have? We have.
I am going to move it on right now. If we can just shift it. Here we go. So this is actually a longer document, but maybe just to begin with what's happening.
Sure. No, and this is sort of what I wanted to talk about. Is I wanted to bring in this idea that these terms, conservative, orthodox, first of all, they didn't mean the same thing then than they do now, but there's also, these aren't movements, right? And I think for Schechter to have to operate in an environment where, or for us to think about Schechter in an environment where the Orthodox movement, the conservative movement, these things are, this sort of flies in the face of this idea of Catholic Israel. But I think this document really kind of lays this out well. The context of this is concerning the proposed Union for Promoting Traditional Judaism, which ultimately becomes the United Synagogue of America. So this idea of the United Synagogue, that this is sort of going to bring everybody together. And this is one of my, I know my teacher, Professor Sarna, when he told the story of kind of these documents that he just came across in the archives that really sort of set off a light bulb. When I came across this document, I think it was in the American Jewish Archives, it was also a similar light bulb, because to me, this really shows how fluid the definitions actually are. So do you want to show the rest of the full kind of document here? Because I love this one, and I just taught this in my class.
It's a phenomenal document. You can blame it on the folks from 100 years ago. I teach it too, and I'm totally in your debt. I use this all the time.
It's one of my favorites, because to me this really shows that what these definitions are is unclear, right? So he says, in order to explain my views, and this is Mendes de Cyrus.
Well, Mendes, and just Henry Prayer Mendes, as everybody understands, is the rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, Shereth Israel, the minister, the reverend. He is the founder of the Orthodox Union, of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America in 1898. He is an incredibly important figure at this moment.
Right, and if anybody's going to be able to get at this distinction, it's him. And I think that's important. He identifies as Orthodox. So look what he says in his definitions. He says, let me explain, in order to explain my views, let us for the moment agree to the following definitions, even if they are not exactly correct. So first of all, this means that there aren't clear definitions, right? This is a conversation of people who are at the forefront of trying to figure this out. And even at that point, they can only say, let us agree to these, even if they're not quite correct. The first, he says, Russian Orthodoxy. And this is where he's talking about the Agadas HaRabbanim in a sense. This is the Orthodoxy which insists upon certain ritual and certain forms, but objects to English sermons. Again, being that idea of an English sermon. Has little or no decorum, fails to hold its young men and women, refuses in its schools Hebrew and religious education to girls, cares little about whether women and girls attend religious service or not, insists upon such customs as the shaitel, and I love this part, in a word, degrades womanhood as you and I understand it. And to me, that shows such a split within what we're calling Orthodox, because Mendes himself identifies as Orthodox. Yet he's referring to this other type, he calls it Russian Orthodoxy, in clearly negative terms, degrades womanhood as you and I understand it. But then moving on to this, and I'll just kind of lay this out and then want other people to jump in here, then modern Orthodoxy, as represented by, for example, your and my congregations and several Ashkenaz congregations such as Baltimore, Philadelphia, Montreal, this Orthodoxy resists innovations such as organs, pews, meaning mixed seating, disuse of talith, female voices in the choir, Christians in the choir, etc. And then how do you contrast it with this? Conservative Judaism. Let this term mean the Judaism which permits some of the innovations named. Which ones? Like, it's unclear. And so again, it sort of shows this line of what's in the middle. And then the last thing I just point out here is, as we talk about who's going to be included in Catholic Israel, who is Schechter looking for? I think there is a clear sense of, in one place we hear, or often he says, or often we read, it's everybody but reform. But he divides reform into these two categories: Reform Judaism, and he says, which in addition to such innovations, meaning the conservative, rejects certain historical beliefs and aspirations such as restoration. But fifth, Radical Reform, which publishes the Pittsburgh Platform. And so to me, it's clear in this that there are these, at least for those in the middle, that there are these two poles, these two very opposite poles. But what's left for the middle, it's unclear.
Well, and it's also, if you were a betting man and you were in that first meeting when they are in effect reviewing that taxonomy that he's just put forth, and you had to predict, okay, so what's going to be the dominant party that's going to walk out of this thing? You could just as easily, and of course this is basically the bet that Schechter makes, well, it'll be the conservatives and the modern Orthodox, because the Venn diagram has the most overlap between those two. Even though, of course, we know that that's not how Mendes, even though he really doesn't respect Russian Orthodoxy, and he sees it in many ways as pretty backwards and presumably, quote unquote, un-American and not likely to transplant successfully. That's he ends up in effect going with them as opposed to the people with whom, in cultural terms, he has much more in common with.
Right. Mendes is somebody who is really being very creative about this nomenclature, about that term taxonomy. He toys the idea of historical Judaism, which is looking at this more Hungarian Zacharias Franco model. You saw that he uses modern Orthodoxy, not exactly modern Orthodoxy we mean today. It becomes a very loaded term in the interwar period. He calls himself just Jewish at a point, like the Eastern European Orthodox Jews in downtown New York. So he's somebody who is deeply invested in the project of trying to figure out what type of, he senses that this idea of designation and branding, they didn't use the term back then, is going to be critical. And yet he's unable, it's a moving target that he's never really able to seize on.
Yeah. It is worth recalling, I think, that the Anglican British model is, at the end of the day, what they are going to hope for. First of all, because I think some of those Sephardic congregations were sympathetic, and then one of the seminary's graduates, Hertz, is going to become Chief Rabbi of England, and the very term United Synagogue is a term borrowed from England, and I think there was a hope of a kind of Anglo-American Orthodoxy influenced by Anglicanism, what in America would be called Episcopalianism, high church, very much top down, in which the leaders would play a huge role in defining and being the role models of how one could be both modern and traditional, and with an enormous role also for scholars, remembering that there were someone like Moses Gaster, scholar rabbis, and those were people that Schechter likes, and Hertz himself was very scholarly. So that, I think, is how they hoped things would turn out. As we know, of course, the Agudat HaRabbanim, which they're not paying much attention to in 1902, is actually going to foil that more than happened in England. Yes, in England, you would have the chief rabbinate's brand of orthodoxy and then a more right-wing orthodoxy. That doesn't happen. In America, where the conservative movement is eventually pushed out of what is defined as orthodoxy. But that's going to happen, as Professor Cohen shows, much later. For a long time, you're going to have plenty of seminary graduates who imagine themselves to be Orthodox, and you're going to have a lot of seminary graduates who at different times are either going to be in Orthodox synagogues or in conservative synagogues. Think Louis M. Epstein as a good example. So it's very important, it seems to me, not to read what happens later into this earlier period, but to see the Schechter era as one with all sorts of possibilities. And then we can see and ask the question, why did it turn out the way it did? And why did this world of a two-movement Judaism, or if you prefer this letter, a five-movement Judaism, end up being largely a world of three-movement Judaism?
Bev, I would also just add to what Jonathan just said. It's also a real opportunity for your students to realize that post-Holocaust, there's a kind of a romanticization that we've all grown up with about Eastern Europe that figures like Heschel were responsible for, and just the fact that so many people lost family from Eastern Europe. But you read the documents from this period, Russian Jewry is a problem. So many people throughout the world think of it as a problem. It's poor, it's oppressed, it has backwards rabbinic leadership, it's not going anywhere, it's falling apart, the shtetl is decomposing, immigration, right? All these forces, people do not valorize it. To the contrary, they think nothing could be better than if we fix it. Zionists have one set of prescriptions for what that fixing would look like in political or cultural terms. People in the United States have a different set of prescriptions. But what they all agree upon is that Russian Jewry is a kind of an endangered, problematic community.
But I would just add that, Schechter in the 1905 interview, and he's clearly reacting. He could ignore, but he doesn't. He says, of course I'm Orthodox. Why are they saying otherwise? And later, and we'll introduce that next week in the class, is the emergence of Bernard Revel in 1915, just as Schechter passes away. He's not willing to budge in the formation of Yeshiva College without the approval of the Agudas Rabbanim. In fact, ordination at RIETS is duly conferred by the Agudas Rabbanim and Bernard Revel. And when Bernard Revel passes away in 1940, it's the Agudas Rabbanim who emerge and say, you know what? This is our seat to fill. This isn't the Board of Trustees. I want, though, to close with Professor Cohen. If we take a look back to that slide, because that's why I think that Schechter is so interesting, is that he is such a charismatic, important figure, and he is forcing everyone to react. And under that backdrop, in Mike's book, The Birth of Conservative Judaism, which really, in some ways, replaces Marshall Sclair's book, and then Moshe Davis's book, The Emergence of Conservative Judaism. That conservative Judaism doesn't emerge. It's born out of the 20th century. It's not just Reform and Orthodox who are reacting to this charismatic person, but it's actually his students, and I'll be quiet at this moment for Mike to take over. It's his charisma and the transmission of that charisma that allows conservative Judaism to be born with his students.
Sorry, I was muted. I'll just, Zoom has a great feature that gives you these big exclamation points if you try to speak and you're actually muted. So I was able to figure it out very quickly. No, I think this is a figure. I mean, you see all these students and their wives and the younger and the older. these are his students. They spend summers together. They take their families to Maine, up to Tannersville, New York, and they become friends with not only each other but also have Schechter and Matilda Schechter as these kind of parental figures. A lot of these seminary students are in their teens. The students in the early 20s, at least Schechter students, are kind of considered older, and so it's almost like this, what we see today as a college age population, making these sort of friends. But one of the brilliance here that Schechter is able to kind of, there's a generation that tries to carry on Schechter's message, is that he doesn't appoint a successor. And it's not clear who's going to be the next Schechter. And that's why he's so successful. Because if he appoints someone who is sort of a self-identified Orthodox, or says, here are my rules, then anybody outside of that wouldn't follow. If he appoints somebody who is so-called conservative, or advocates mixed seating or something along that, the right wing, the more traditionalists would be alienated. And so through the United Synagogue, and I'll kind of stop here. I could go on for days. I know we're sort of bumping up against time here, but through the United Synagogue, which embraces these differences, that is the way that Schechter's students, that Schechter's disciples, are able to create the mechanisms of a movement. Happy to answer more questions on that, Professor Elif, if you'd like me to, but
I think that was incredibly well said, and we are bumping up against time.
Someone has asked on the chat
Yes.
why the schools were named after Solomon Schechter, and perhaps we should point out it's precisely the symbol of Solomon Schechter. None of those schools, not one of them, was named in his lifetime. Indeed, it was substantially after his
30
lifetime.
years later, yeah.
But in their mind, Schechter becomes the personification of everything that they hoped American Judaism would be: traditional and modern, full of learning, and not just traditional Talmudic learning, but also modern learning, meaning this man had studied in yeshiva, this man had also been in Cambridge. And so Schechter becomes this great symbol of conservative Judaism, much later, Rabbi Soloveitchik will be seen by his disciples. A sequel could be written, Soloveitchik's disciples, as the personification of modern Orthodoxy. There are certain kinds of charismatic figures who are like that, and in the same way, some people remembered Schechter in a very traditional way. Some people remembered him in a very modern way. And everybody, as Mike shows in his book, had a little bit their own Schechter. And of course, the further removed you were from Schechter, the more you could attribute things to him. And I give my late father the last word, because you noted him. In the 1950s, when he came to the seminary, there were still many things that were done. Well, it's been that way since Schechter's day. And the fact that Schechter had by then been dead for 40 years and almost nobody remembered him was less important than the fact that he had set up certain guiding traditions, or at least they were attributed to him, and the seminary felt that it was preserving him. That's the kind of symbol that Schechter becomes.
And that becomes that unifying force, even if different people look to Schechter for different things and revere him for different things. it doesn't matter. He still becomes that figure. I have to apologize. I need to hop off because
Okay. So I think we're gonna close with that. So I'll never write Soloveitchik's disciples. I'm much more likely to write Sarna's disciples in my memoir. This is terrific. Thank you all so much. You know, at a time in which we're feeling very, very apart, it was terrific to feel close together.
Well, thank you for putting it together. It was Zev's idea, and Zev executed it, and it's really been wonderful for an hour to take one's mind off anything but American Jewish history and Jewish learning, and perhaps we should have other similar such gatherings as the days move on. But thank you for arranging this.
And Zev, all you have to provide is just provide the Zoom and the Romanian sausages, please.
You got it, although I think they closed, but maybe I could send somebody. Anyway, thank you so much, and to everybody who participated by watching.
All right, everybody stay safe, and let's hear only good news.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes,
Thanks.
everyone healthy.
And Mike, I hope you don't. I hope the Israel Studies thing doesn't get canceled in New Orleans. Looking forward to being there.